This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends, and this is a continuation of and the third session of recordings with Mr. Harvey Everest. And in this session, we're going to be talking about some of the civic and community things that he's been involved in, some of the experiences, some of the stories, behind the scenes things he may know about, as well as some of the individuals with whom he has been involved. We won't talk chronologically as much today as we will be just about subjects and kind of skipping around. I'd like first to talk about some of the things in which you have had a civic involvement and those that you have been most involved in. And first, I'd like to talk about the Medical Research Foundation. You've been involved in that, and I understand that you spend more time on that at this point than any of your other civic work. Could you tell us your first involvement with it and some of the experiences that you've had and some of the things that you know about the organization?
I've been involved there for nearly 20 years, or maybe a little longer, almost since its inception. Dean McGee and Mr. J.G. Peterball, McAllister, and Bill Payne here, and two or three other rest of us were inveigled by Hugh Payne to start this Medical Research Foundation. He dreamed it up. He was a dreamer, a good deal like Stanley Draper, but he was not like Stanley, and he was thoroughly impractical. He needed somebody to ride herd on him, and we did a pretty good job. But he came up with one idea after another, which most of them proved to be good, and it developed into one of the great medical research organizations of the country. Well, I don't know. I've forgotten about Hugh Payne's origin. I could find out easily enough, but I've forgotten. But yeah, he was here when he started that, and the first big boost to that came from Mr. J.G. Peterball. He gave us $100,000, and in those days we used to put on annual campaigns for money, which would sometimes get us as much as $300,000 or $400,000. But later on, we made a deal with the United Appeal to discontinue those campaigns, and they put a certain amount of money in their budget each year for us, so we wouldn't have to use the manpower to put on a separate campaign, which has worked out very well for all of us. But it is of tremendous interest to me, and I'm deeply involved in the whole medical center complex as well as just the Medical Research Foundation, because we're just a part of the entire operation out there. It's very interesting work for me, interesting project, and I've served on the executive committee as its chairman for many years. Now I've got myself relieved of those duties, but I still serve on the executive committee. So it's been a source of great satisfaction to me. Whether or not I've contributed much is another story. I don't know whether I have or not, but I hope I have. Anyway.
How did the center evolve? I mean, did you? I remember when they had the dedication. In fact, I was there. It was in '49, I believe.
I believe it was, yes.
But did the experimentation work begin before they built the center, or did it begin with the completion of that?
It began with the completion of it. Of course, certain physicians around town were doing some in their own offices, but and some of those immediately joined up with us. But mainly the main research started when we opened the building up and recruited men from all over the country to come in and establish their laboratories. And it has been a very, very successful effort. We've made a lot of breakthroughs in the years we've been in operation out there. In fact, it's so successful, and considered so by the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation, that we get grants each year for research. I think we're the fourth largest in the United States recipient of grants from those institutions, and the National Heart Foundation and the National Cancer Association. We have a budget nowadays of something like $7 million, and we are able to carry on at that level. It constantly increases, of course.
Wasn't John Rogers the first president of that?
Yes, John Rogers was the first president and continued for many, many years. And I should have mentioned him at the outset as one of those who started the foundation. John has been my close friend for 50 years, and we're still very close.
Why don't you talk a little about John Rogers? He's been really prominent in so many different things.
Well, John and I happen to belong to the same church, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and he has been quite active in the church nationwide. He's been the president of their national convention, and he's involved in many things involving this state. Of course, he was the chairman of the Board of Regents for the higher education for years. He's a very wise and astute attorney. I have one or two amusing things to say about John. Although he graduated from the University of Oklahoma Law School and later received other degrees, but he never practiced in court at all except for Mr. Chapman, Mr.
E.B. Chapman. E.B. Chapman.
Yes, of Tulsa. And they sat across the desk from each other for, I believe, 52 years. Each one of them always wore a hat, and neither one of them ever addressed the other except Mr. Chapman and Mr. Rogers. I thought, well, they must have been young men once, and that seemed a little strange to me that they would never, that they would be so formal all of their lives. But they had a great association, and Mr. Chapman depended greatly upon Mr. Rogers for the disposal of his very large estate, which has benefited, of course, the Medical Research Foundation profoundly.
What do you feel is the real secret and key behind John Rogers' leadership? He has been a leader in so many fields over the years.
Well, John Rogers is just a person who wanted to serve his fellow man, and in whatever capacity he felt able to do so. And there aren't too many of them in this world. He's just almost a unique individual. In fact, as I thought for many years, he was the first citizen of Oklahoma because of these many, many great activities for the good of the people of Oklahoma.
Now, he was the president, I know, of the Disciples of Christ. Do you think of any particular contributions that stand out that he made to the Disciples of Christ?
No, I think not, except that he was a very wise presiding officer, and he many, many times kept a group of 1,000 delegates from going astray, which so many convention delegates do if they're not properly led. And he was a great leader and was able to lead.
He was one of most of the presidents have been in the ministry. Isn't that correct?
That is true. Yes.
Was he able? Sometimes there's a clash, I know, within the religious community between the professional ministry and the many of the lay leaders. How was he able to handle this sort of thing?
Well, I will say that he was able to handle it. It may be because the so-called Christian Church, Disciples of Christ Brotherhood, just don't seem to have many divisions within them, and I don't recall of any real division we've ever had in our brotherhood between the laity and the professional ministry. We've been very fortunate in that respect.
Do you think of any stories or any anecdotes involving John Rogers that might be of interest?
No, I do not believe that I do. He was quite a serious man and very seldom indulged in small talk. But everybody loved him, and certainly everyone respected him. But I don't really have any anecdotes about John, except he was just a great man in my books and still is.
You were, I believe, the first president of the Symphony after it merged out of the WPA. Could you talk a little about some of about what it was, what the problems were of bringing about this transition, and some of the things that may have happened?
Well, the problems, of course, were just simply one great big problem. That was money, because they formerly had been supported by the federal government, and all at once it was cast upon our laps here in Oklahoma City to either abandon the project or get it going. And I recall very vividly that I was called one day by Mrs. Anthony Klassen, who then lived at the old Biltmore Hotel, and was asked to come down to the hotel to visit her, and so I did that. Ms. Klassen, I guess, was some 20 years my senior, and was a grand lady. So I went down, and she had two other ladies there with her, and they talked me into heading a campaign for the first Symphony Drive, which I recall was of some very modest amount, maybe $75,000 thereabouts. Victor Alessandro, by the way, continued with us after the WPA days. He was the first and only conductor for many years, and a great one too. But the odd part about this is that Mrs. Klassen and the other two ladies with her, they were all wealthy widows, but I never could get one of them to contribute a dime to the campaign. I was not too much upset about it because I knew them, but it was rather strange that after getting me committed, they did not commit themselves. And the campaign, I think, maybe was either barely successful or barely unsuccessful. At least we started it on its way.
That seems kind of strange. I understood that Ms. Klassen had made quite a few contributions to different things.
Well, she did in later years, I think, but at least to my campaign, maybe she doubted my leadership somewhat, but at least I took it on when nobody else would.
Maybe she was testing you, see if you could do it without it.
I want to tell you about Mrs. Klassen,
yes.
though, if I may.
Sure.
She was the first lady, first female employed in an office, I believe, in the state of Oklahoma. When my father and my uncle J.H. Everest made their run into Oklahoma in 1889, the United States Land Office for this district was in Kingfisher, Oklahoma. And that's where all of the disputes, and there were hundreds of disputes about who got there first, and they were settled mostly in the federal jurisdiction there at Kingfisher. And Mrs. Klassen was the secretary to the federal marshal or wherever he was that had charge of that office. She had a typewriter. My father used to tell me that weighed over 100 pounds. It was two keyboards, capital letters up the top and the lower letters beyond, and she'd always have a cluster of men around her watching her operate that typewriter. But she was the first woman in Oklahoma to serve in an office.
She was very obviously a good business person, because after he died, she ran the real estate company for quite a number of years, didn't she?
Yes, she was a very, very competent person indeed. She and a nephew, I've forgotten his name, was Jones, operated that very large real estate enterprise for many years, and quite successfully.
How did she and Mr. Klassen meet? Do you know?
No, I did know, but I've forgotten that.
Did you know Mr. Klassen?
Not well. You see, I was probably 30 years his junior. Just barely remember him.
Did you know Mr. Chartel?
Knew Mr. Chartel pretty well, even though he was about the same age, but I knew him.
You know any?
Well.
Can you recall any experiences, any stories, or anything about him?
No, I really can't. Of course, he established the first street railway here, and then later on, oddly enough, there was another street railway system started and flourished for a number of years, which was owned by Mr. Patterson. Most people have forgotten that.
Moss Patterson?
No, not Moss Patterson. No relation to Moss. But the days of the streetcar soon ended, of course. But Mr. Chartel was a very fine, far-sighted person and greatly respected in the community. But I did not ever know him socially.
I understood that Mr. Harn owned a single line, the Yellow Mule that went out by the state capitol. You remember that?
That's right. I'd forgotten about that, but that is true. And Mr. and Ms. Harn, of course, lived right north of 16th Street, maybe a block or two. They owned the whole quarter section out there, and they raised their niece,
Florence Wilson.
Florence Wilson, who was a great friend of my older brother. The two of them went all through school together, and were very close for a great many years. And Florence, of course, has carried on when the Harns left their estate to her, and she's been a very fine citizen indeed.
She gave that home to the city of Oklahoma City, and it's being developed now into the 89ers home.
Yes, that is correct. That's correct. She's been a great help to the Oklahoma City University, as you know, and to many other causes here in Oklahoma City. Florence does not like to be reminded of her age, I know, but but I've known her now for some 70 years.
Well, her health's pretty bad now, I think.
I did not know that.
I don't think gets out at all, but that home is in the process of being restored for public visiting.
And I did not know that.
You didn't, and they're building an 89er museum, which will be behind there, and the park department will operate it, but the 89ers Association will be very involved.
It was a very simple two-story white frame house out there on this 160 acres, and I know that my brother and I've been out with him. I used to ride out there in the buggy from where we lived on East 10th Street.
Did you ever know Mr. Harn?
No, I did not. Very few people did know Mr. Harn.
I understood that was true. That he gave half the land for the capital, I believe.
Yes.
But I understood he was sometimes difficult to get along with a lot of people.
Very.
Do you recall anything about the old Yellow Mule line? I've heard people mention it, and
no, I really do not. Except, of course, they had just one small streetcar with not double trucks but single trucks, fore and aft, and seats along the side, and it would seat probably 20, 25 people or so. But they weren't usually traveled very much on that line.
You mentioned Moss Patterson and Chartel's lines. Did they run in the same area? Was there any division of territory there? Or?
No, I corrected you. It wasn't Moss Patterson.
Oh, I mean, yes,
no.
That's right. I'm Rob.
Patterson's line, the only one I remember, went north on Harvey Avenue from downtown up to about 23rd and returned maybe on Walker, but I've forgotten. But they were not competing directly with John Chartel's line.
The big one that swung around Broadway to Main Street and across there, was that Chartel's?
Yes. And of course Chartel later put on the interurban to Norman and to Guthrie, Edmund and Guthrie, and El Reno, that's right.
Wasn't there a close relationship between Classen and Chartel?
Yes, they were close friends.
Did they? Wasn't there some joint ownership in?
Well, there could be in some of their real estate investments because manifestly, if a streetcar line would go into some vacant territory that Classen owned, it would help him greatly, you know. And, the first large extension of Chartel's line went from 16th and 17th and Classen Boulevard out to Belle Isle Lake, you know. And that was when the Belle Isle became a considerable resort out there, when the streetcar line was put out there.
Why don't you talk about that? That operated, I think, until about 1928 when they sold it to OG&E. Can you recall any events that took place out in the Belle Isle Park?
No specific events, but they had all kinds of rides and everything you'd have in an amusement park out there. And of course, the boat rides were the chief attraction to young people. And they had a swimming beach, and they had a covered building there, which was really not an auditorium, but
pavilion.
A pavilion, and people would take their lunches out there. The families would. It was quite a family place to meet, but I don't think it was a place to have anything like the Chautauqua lectures or anything of that kind.
No.
It was an amusement park, and very, very much used in those days too.
A lot of boating and fishing, I understood.
Yes, indeed. Boating especially. Boating especially by young couples.
Now, I understood that original power plant, not the one that's there now, but the one that went down about 12 or 13 years ago, was used to operate the railway system and the amusement park.
That is right. Then the OG took that over.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And built the big one.
Yes.
The do you remember Delmar Garden?
Yes, I do, but not too well. I was a little boy of 10, 11 or 12 years old when that flourished, and I recall the streetcars going out there, and on days when they had baseball games, for instance, streetcars were just jammed with people, and the kids would jump on the running boards of the streetcar, and the conductor came along, they'd jump off and get on the next car as it came by, and I don't think the conductors ever collected much fares from those kids when we used to go out there to the Delmar Garden, because it was quite a game to avoid the conductors, even though it was only a nickel.
Was I understood quite a few cars went in there. I think there were 20 cars that operated into that area.
Oh yes, it was just a succession of cars moving from downtown out to Delmar Garden, and they had prize fights and all kinds of entertainment out there.
I understood that some of the classic names, John L. Sullivan and some of those, fought out there at the time.
Yes, they did, and I think they had some burlesque out there, which seemed pretty dirty in those days, but very tame nowadays.
Yeah. Do you recall any events at Delmar Garden?
Well, John Philip Sousa was a great favorite out there, and he would come every year, and I expect he was the greatest attraction they've ever had at the Delmar Gardens.
Did you hear him?
Oh yes, indeed, yes indeed. Every small boy heard him in those days, as well as every adult. He really stirred the pulse of America.
Did you ever meet him?
No, I never did. I was just a small boy when he came by.
Where did he perform out there? Was what sort of an auditorium or outdoor thing did they have for that?
You know, I don't recall. I think that they had a grandstand. I think that he performed in front of that grandstand in the open. I believe he did.
Now, I understood they had auto races there, too.
Yes, and I do not remember those. The first auto races I remember out at the Fairgrounds on East 10th Street. And they were very well attended in those days. Very thrilling, too, I tell you. Passenger car could get up to 50 miles an hour and maintain it around that track. It was really making the time, you know.
Did you ever see the Barney Oldfield drive?
Yeah, if I have, I've forgotten it. I expect I have, though. But
I understood he raced at Delmar Garden.
Well, I expect he did. Our family had the first car in Oklahoma. J.H. Everest had the very first car, a Stanley Steamer. Then my father had the second, which was a one-cylinder, 8-horsepower Cadillac. And then we were involved in automobiles ever since then. We had almost every make was made in those early days.
Yeah, you were telling me about on our last interview, or the first interview, about the automobile, because
yes.
I had heard that either your father or your uncle had that first one.
Yeah.
Do you remember the original fairgrounds over in the military park before they built the one in 1907?
No, I do not remember that one at all. And where was that, Penn?
Well, it was not far east of the. It was in the old military area, not far east of the tracks. In
that area.
Somewhere in that area. I don't know the exact location, but it's in that area.
No, I don't remember that one.
Of course, 1907, year of statehood, I believe, was when the second one came in.
Yes.
On Easter.
Yeah.
We've diverted some from where we started. When we got to Miss Classen, we diverted into some of those things, but let's move back to the symphony. You knew Victor Alessandro, Why don't you tell us something about him as a personality as well as a musician?
Well, Victor, of course, was a very fine musician and a good disciplinarian with his orchestra. As you know, most of you do know, he had polio as a youth, and he always walked with a limp. But by and large, he was a very fine artist. And you know, after his many years of service here, that he moved to San Antonio, where he continued as conductor until just a couple of years before his death. But he was one of the great conductors of America, in my opinion, and the opinion of many people who are fond of symphony music. And a very handsome fellow, too, genial and well-liked.
Do you recall any stories, funny incidents, or anything like that regarding him?
I do not about Victor. No, I do not.
Now, were you elected president of the symphony after your campaign?
It's been so long ago, some 46, 7 years. I'm sure that was the sequence of events.
Well, I guess you must have been at least somewhat successful to retain you, at least.
Well, I tell you, I was involved in many, many campaigns, often as chairman of them, and very few people in Oklahoma City have tried to extract money from their fellow citizens as often as I have. Sometimes successfully and sometimes not.
Do you recall any other experiences with the symphony?
No, I really do not. I've been friends with every conductor we've had, and good personal friends, but I don't recall any other instances. I've been one who's always kind of battled the conductor, however, to let the audience enjoy the music as much as they could and not educate them as much as they tried.
Talk some about Guy Fraser Harrison, some of the experiences, anecdotes, if you remember any stories or observations.
Guy was a very strong conductor, quite different from Victor, in that he was a very stern disciplinarian with his orchestra, and very, very good, very professional. And he and I were great friends, and then with his wife, Seal, we were, and Ms. Everest too, we were all close friends, and we continue to be. But I cannot recall any instance connection with him, but except of later years, I did criticize him a little bit to his face, at least, and nowhere else, that he tried too much to educate his public and not didn't give them enough music that they really came to enjoy. But nevertheless, by and large, he did a great job for Oklahoma City.
Do you recall any stories or any funny things or anything like that regarding Guy Fraser Harrison?
No, I do not.
What about your activity? Have you been very active with the YMCA?
Yes, I've been a board member, I guess, for at least 50 years, probably longer than anybody else. As long as Mr. Gaylord lived, he was one who was a member longer than I have, I believe, but that would be the only one. And I'm now a life member of the board. But for many, many years, I was chairman of one committee or another, usually the finance committee. I don't believe I was ever president because I never wanted to be. Or maybe because I wasn't asked, but at least I never did want to be. But I've been deeply involved in the Y practically all of my adult life. I remember my Uncle J.H. Everest was one of about 8 men who started the YMCA in Oklahoma City, and they have that original subscription list there at the Y now. And I remember my uncle put in $10, and the other fellows, some of them 2 and some of them 5. And that's the way the YMCA started in Oklahoma City.
Do you remember when the YMCA was in the old Baltimore building across the street north from the old Biltmore, where the Biltmore was later built?
No, I do not. My first involvement was really when the built the building up on what is now Robert S. Carter Avenue.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that campaign was not too long after World War I, as I recall.
That is right.
And why don't you talk a little about that campaign and that building? Things you may remember.
Well, Penn, I regret to say that my memory
You don't remember that?
is not as good as it ought to be. I'm not as I just don't remember that very much. J.B. White was the executive director in those days, and a very
that far back
fine one too. Yes, he was.
I didn't know.
As a matter of fact, I served on that board for some years under J.B., and then I guess my business was required more of my time. Maybe it should have, and I didn't attend a few meetings, and J.B. called me in and said, "Harvey, now we like to have you on the board, but now you've missed the last 3 or 4 meetings consecutively, and I think maybe you'd better resign until you can give it more time." And I did for 2 or 3 years, and then re-elected me again, and I've tried to be a better board member since I had that talking to.
Do you recall any other thing about J.B. White or any observations about him? He was a very serious person.
Oh, he's a very serious person, but a very, very effective Y director. His wife was certainly dedicated to it in the same sense that Norman McLeod was, you know, and seems to be a characteristic of those men who devote their life to YMCA work. He was just a very great director for us, and laid the groundwork for our present great YMCA efforts here in Oklahoma City.
I know the YMCA here has never allowed itself to get away from basically what it was organized for, which is sometimes a problem with some organizations. They lose their principle, their original principle.
That is true, and I'm still somewhat concerned about YMCA's here and nationwide, in that their programs seem to me to tend to be more athletic oriented and less emphasis on the Christian part of the YMCA. But they certainly do a great job with the young fellows, boys and girls, who regularly attend the YMCA and participate in the programs. I think turn out to be better citizens than those who just roam the streets.
You were on the board of Phillips University for a lot of years. I'd like for you to recall back your first involvement with Phillips and what the campus was like when you, who was the president then, and what it was like when you first became involved.
The first president when I came involved was the second president of the university, who was Dr. I.N. McCash, whom my mother knew and my mother and father knew up in southern Kansas as young people. And my mother persuaded him to come down to Phillips to take over the presidency when the former president had died. And when I was first put on the board, my uncle J.H. Everest was then on the board too. They consisted of just one building, what they call now the Old Main, and I think one other building, a small gymnasium. That was what was out there then. Very small budget, and we had great difficulty even raising that. And for many years, it was just entirely separate from the city of Enid. You had to take a horse and buggy to ride 3 miles out east to get to the university even. And Enid citizens were not concerned about it, hardly knew that it existed out there. And during the Great Depression in 1929 and on for a few years, some of our dedicated teachers just had to go almost without any pay, but they stayed with us, and no school has ever had a more dedicated staff than we had in those trying days. We came through it all, and now I think we have one of the great private schools of the Southwest. I was largely influential in the selection of every president we've had since Dr. McCash retired. And by the way, after Dr. McCash retired some years, when he was then in his 91st year, he was invited to a board meeting as a guest, and he apologized for being a little late. As I say, he was 91 years old, and he said he'd been to his first dentist he'd ever been to in his life. He had a tooth pulled. It was the first tooth he'd ever lost in all of his 91 years. Very remarkable person.
I think he lived to about 96.
Yes, he did. He lived at a great age and
was always active.
Fine Christian gentleman, very active, just like a little bird, you know. He was
very small
and slight, but very active. And then, with one or two others of our board members, we went to Columbia, Missouri, and got Dr. E.S. Briggs, Eugene Briggs, to come down to Phillips. He was then the president of the girls' school up there. Forgotten the name of it now. Columbia still exists, but and he served as our president for, I guess, nearly 18 years. When he retired, well, a few of us got Dr. Hallie Gantz, the pastor of the First Christian Church in Tulsa, to become our president, and he was a great person, well loved and respected by everybody. He was the first man really to bring the townspeople of Enid into a close relationship with the university. He had a special gift for making friends, and a lovely wife who helped him too. And he suffered a very untimely death through heart failure not too many years ago. And then, after quite a long selection process, we persuaded Dr. Thomas Brose to become our president. He was the executive vice president of Dr. Sharp at OU. A young man, then 39, I believe. But he only served 2 years until 2 years ago he had open heart surgery, and his doctors told him that he must not ever live such a strenuous life as he lived as president of Phillips University. And so we had to select a successor to him, and the present president is Dr. Sam Curl, C-U-R-L, who's the executive vice president of the Texas Tech at Lubbock, Texas, who was recommended to us by Dr. Bob Combe at OSU.
Dr. Briggs was pretty, you mentioned the involvement with townspeople. Dr. Briggs was pretty involved in the city of Enid, wasn't he?
Dr. Briggs was very active in the Lions Club. Of course, he was international president of the Lions Club. But no real effort was made to secure yearly financing, as just as a matter of procedure in the city of Enid. And now it's a part of their yearly program, and they now raise more or less $200,000 every year, a little more this year, which is strictly a bonus for the university and a must and a necessity too.
Going back to these, to begin with, you mentioned when you first became involved, and they had the two buildings. How many students did they have then?
We had about 350 students.
How many do you have now?
We have in the neighborhood of 1,100 to 1,200 all the time.
Do you
and pardon me, we want to keep it not more than 1,400. We want to keep it a small church-related school where young men and women can come and get their education in a small classrooms, the competent instructors in a Christian atmosphere. And we think we've been quite successful in that.
These people who have been the presidents, I knew most of them and I knew of Dr. McCash, never did meet him, but they've all been rather strong personalities and interesting people, and there may be some good stories about them that you can that you may recall. You mentioned this one about Dr. McCash. Do you recall anything else about him? I understood he was quite a personality.
Well, I don't recall anything else about him much. He was the age of my father and mother, and just as sharp as a tack, full of good humor as well as common sense, and a great Christian gentleman, and a fine a fine head of a school because he knew the academic process and he knew how to pick teachers. And he, in some ways, probably he certainly is one of the greatest presidents that any university in this state's ever had.
Now, Dr. Briggs, I know although he came to Phillips out of from Missouri, he really is Oklahoma backgrounded and was president of Southeastern
in Durant. That is right.
And also had been a superintendent of schools in Oklahoma places. And do you recall any? Do you recall? In fact, I think he went out politically when they were firing when Governor Murray fired all the college presidents.
I think that's correct. Yes, and I think that's probably when he went to Missouri.
Yeah, that's what he told me.
But he was a great president and well loved and respected too by all of his staff, all of his teaching staff too, and by the people of Enid. He was a very fine and is a very fine person and my very close friend.
I made a tape with Dr. Briggs about a year ago or so.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Do you recall any stories about him or any experiences or interesting things, funny things or such about Dr. Briggs?
No, I really do not. He used to kid with me a lot about my removing him from that beautiful atmosphere in this girls' school up in Missouri down to the harsh realities of the financial aspects of Phillips University, where he had a battle for his life for years, but he also ended by saying he didn't regret a day of it. He loved his life at university.
Where's Dr. Brose? Is he still teaching up there? Is he?
Dr. Brose, we created a new position for him. As president of Phillips University, as every president had done prior to this time, he played a dual role as most college presidents do, especially of independent schools. He had to be a president of the university and see to the curriculum, the hiring and firing of teachers, and the administration. And also on the other side, he had to raise money for the university. That was a dual role. And that was a role that his doctors told him he could not pursue anymore. So we created a new position. The then president of the Board of Trustees resigned, Mr. F.L. Holden of Poto, Oklahoma, and then the trustees elected Tom Brose as chairman of the board on a salary, whose only duties were to, you might call it public relations, but to be real definite about it, his duties involved money raising only. And Tom Brose, very wisely, he and his family moved back to Norman to remove themselves from the new president's hair and let him pursue his duties without any interference by the former president. And so he lives in Norman now and very successfully busily engaged in raising an endowment of $13 million more than we've had at Phillips.
Do you recall any events at Phillips that stand out in your mind that might be mentioned, or special innovations that are of special mention?
I do not, Penn, because it's been every board meeting we've had, and I presided as chairman of the board for 25 years. And it's been a history. The meetings have been concerned with the hiring of new teachers, the retirement of old ones, the maintenance of the campus, the building of new buildings when we could secure the money, the building of housing with the assistance of the federal government, and those kind of housekeeping details we have had, and also with the money-raising activities of that department of our school. As you know, we're closely allied with the Christian church. We've always had men calling on the churches throughout our whole area. And through them, really, in Dr. Briggs' time, I must give him credit for this, and I should have before. Dr. Briggs had an idea of increasing our income from churches, and that was this, that we would establish what we called a lifeline church, which we would explain to every congregation in our area. And that meant that that church would, through its church budget, contribute to Phillips University $1 per year per member as a minimum. And that effort raised our income from churches from some $30,000 or $40,000 a year to $400,000 a year, about that range continually. And some churches have gone $2, $3, and $4 per member, and they've maintained that. And they pay that by the month, which is the secret of getting money from churches, because at the end of the year they're almost broke. Mm-hmm. If you get it by the month, you get it. And that was really one of the great contributions that Dr. Briggs made to the ongoing of Phillips University. Without that, I doubt if we could have survived.
Mm-hmm. Phillips has played a major role in the band festival.
Yes, indeed.
People.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that?
Well, we very early, I think perhaps in probably in the latter part of Dr. McCash's tenure, we had a very strong music department, and they developed a good band program, and I think that band festival initiated there with a few high schools coming to Enid once a year, and Dr. Briggs came over. That was developed enormously through its director, and you know, in the last 25 years, it's become nationwide. Festival in which I think maybe 25,000 young men and women come to Phillips for 3 days for this band festival, and it's been a great thing for Phillips University and for the city of Enid.
It's been a real problem recently where to put them.
Yeah, it absolutely has. There's not enough housing in Enid really to properly take care of them. But the kids enjoy it, and lots of them, their parents come too to enjoy the 3 days. It's a very great program.
You had some involvement in the beginning of the Braniff Airlines, which of course is one of the certainly one of the 3 or 4 biggest airlines in the country now. Why don't you tell me everything that you can remember that might be worth remembering about the beginning of Braniff, how the idea came about, and anything else you can think of on that?
Well, back in the 1920s on for 20 years, I guess, Tom Braniff and his family, his wife Bess and their daughter, and for a while their son, who was killed at an early age, though, lived next door to us, out in the country rather, and we lived at 63rd and what we call Lincoln Boulevard, and Tom lived down south of us at an old country club building.
Is that Lincoln
down
or
there.
Kelly you were on?
Well, it was Kelly, but
yeah.
They called Lincoln Boulevard when I rode around
Oh,
there.
they did?
At least we called our address that.
Uh-huh.
But Tom lived right next to us in the southwest, and we were very close friends, and I kept riding horses, and he did, and we would ride together several times a week over to Lincoln Park. Nothing was paved out there in those days. And Tom was in the insurance business with his father, and Tom's younger brother, Phil, who in those days was a pretty harum-scarum kind of a kid, and he learned to fly.
That Paul?
Yeah. And Paul persuaded Tom and me to form a little club called the Oklahoma Aero Club, and we got Virgil Brown and C.R. Anthony and L.H. Pritchard in that, and the 5 of us formed this club, and then Paul went to Detroit and bought a 6-place Stinson for us to use, and we bought it just for fun, of course, entertainment, and it had a 200 horsepower motor in it for 6 passengers, which was grossly inadequate, but we would take trips in it back east, and we went to the West Coast in it once, and came near getting killed twice on that expedition. And I remember once flying south from Los Angeles down to San Diego along the coast. We very suddenly ran into a blinding rainstorm. You couldn't see in front of the plane, and all of a sudden a mountain showed up right square ahead of us. And our pilot veered sharply to the right out toward the Pacific. Didn't know for the next few seconds would we make it or not. But we did. In a few minutes came out blue sky again and on south. But that was probably the closest escape from death we've ever had on an airplane.
Was that Paul Braniff flying?
No, we had another pilot on that trip. And then coming back, the motor failed on us out of El Paso, just right near the mountains east of El Paso. We were able to come down in the desert right close to the Texas Pacific Railway in the desert. And we went through a couple of barbed wire fences and knocked down about 100 cactus trees and came to a stop in the sandy desert. We had run out of oil and the motor froze up on us. Well, we were close enough to the Texas Pacific Railroad, and there were some Mexican workers over there and the foreman. They came running over, and after a couple of hours they went to town and got us some oil and we poured in it. And then these Mexican laborers went to work with pick and shovel and covered up the rattlesnake holes and others to give us some sort of a runway to get off with. And we took off after running about the best part of a mile because the plane was so grossly underpowered, and got home. But after that, we kind of lost our enthusiasm for flying that plane. And so Tom consulted the rest of us, and we decided we'd sell out to Paul, who Tom's doing his backing. Paul wanted to take that plane and start an airline to Tulsa from Oklahoma City. So the rest of us relinquished our interest in that enterprise. And I forgot what he called that in those early days. But he used that plane for a year or so, and then did form the Braniff Airlines, in which we all took stock again. And he bought a Lockheed, five-place Lockheed, which he went on with. Then we took that line from Oklahoma City to Tulsa to Springfield, and to Springfield, Missouri, Springfield, Illinois, and on to Chicago. And I recall very well that Red Mosher and I took the first trip to Chicago and the first trip back. The first trip back was made at night, which even then was quite an adventure in those days. Of course, we had no radio beams. We had nothing in the plane but a bank and turn indicator and an unreliable compass and a gasoline gauge. That's all we had. But Red and I rode that plane back. We left Chicago about 8 o'clock in the evening, just before dark in the summertime. And we traveled all night long. We got Oklahoma City along about 4 o'clock in the morning. And we had a stewardess on there. Had two of them, matter of fact. Young girls are being trained as stewardesses from Okarche. Red and I have often talked about that. They were lovely girls, and we sat up and talked to them all night long in that Lockheed plane. Only had one pilot, mind you, at night with all five of us aboard. But you only take 4 passengers. And
two stewardesses.
Well, they were just training those two girls, see. The stewardesses were a new idea then in air travel. And then that trip to Chicago back and forth lasted for some time. I don't recall how many months or years, but I think in about 2 or 3 years, we succeeded in losing about $600,000. At that point, the rest of us wanted out, and somehow Tom was a good enough salesman that he got Clayton, I've forgotten his first name now, Anderson Clayton Cotton Company in Houston, to become his partner in that enterprise and took the rest of us out. And I later bought stock in it, but that ended my former relationship with Braniff Airways, and it went on from there with the money provided recently by Clayton and then by bank borrowings, and as you know, they gradually grew. And the tragedy is that Tom never lived to the jet age. He died in a freak storm over Shreveport, Louisiana. He and 8 of the Shreveport men were returning from a hunting trip down the Gulf Coast. And as they neared Shreveport, the plane commenced to ice up on the wings, and they had no such thing as de-icing equipment. And finally came down the forest about 10 miles from Shreveport, and all of them were killed.
He died in a small private plane rather than a Braniff
Yes,
plane.
oh yes, a small private plane. I was there at Shreveport at this very time, and
Were you?
notified his widow, Bess, in Washington of it. But Tom was a great friend of ours always. He was a great loss to Oklahoma City when he moved to headquarters to Dallas.
Why did they move to Dallas?
Well, he had the foresightedness, I guess, to see that Dallas was bound to become a great center for aviation. And by that time, of course, he was flying into Dallas, into Houston, into San Antonio, and down to Corpus Christi, and he just envisioned that as the center of his operations. It could just as well have been here, but apparently Dallas had more leadership in that aviation industry than we had in persuading him to move there. But that was one of Stanley Draper's great sorrows, that we lost Braniff Airways headquarters here.
I'm sure it was. He was, Draper was such a tremendous salesman. You wonder
Yes.
how he doesn't lose very many.
No, he doesn't lose very many. Well, our family continued to own planes before we owned that first plane with Tom, and until this day, you know. The fact is, I hired Wiley Post to fly for me once, for a couple of years, but I never trusted him much because he only had one eye. But he proved to be one of the great flyers of the world. But he and I once flew to New York in a Ryan that I owned at that time. And that, too, was before any radio communications. And we were forced down by clouds along the Ohio River near Middletown, Pennsylvania. And the next morning we started off to New York, and commenced to get cloudy. And we flew over clouds, and we finally saw a clear place, and we dived down into that and landed in the field to see where we were. We were about 30 miles from Philadelphia. And so then we took off again and followed the Pennsylvania railway tracks, four tracks up toward New York, and finally the clouds got below us even there, and we went way up high again, which we probably shouldn't have done, but we were about 10,000 feet. Got above the clouds, and we kept it going, and we didn't know where in the world we were, whether we were over the ocean or where. But the first sight we saw was the upper 1/4 of the Empire State Building just sitting on top of the clouds. That's the first time we knew where we were, and we kept on going over to Long Island and landed at a airfield over there in Long Island, and got back into New York. But we didn't have any adventures coming back. But I've had 6 forced landings in my time in my own plane.
That New York one was with Wiley Post as pilot. Is that right?
Yes.
Where did you meet Wiley Post?
Well, here at Oklahoma City, out at the airport. He hung around out there a lot, you know, getting odd jobs when he could.
Yeah. How did he evolve to getting involved in this national race? Who got him? Was that Fane who financed it?
Yes.
Got him involved?
Yeah, that was Fane.
Was he flying for Fane?
I think he was, but I kind of lost track of him for a few years after I.
Mr. Fane was an oil man, wasn't he?
Yes.
Did you know him?
No, just slightly. I was my own pilot for a lot of the time, but Ms. Everest never would permit me to fly overland anywhere without a professional pilot. And Clint Johnson here became my pilot for about 10 years, and saw him last night at the cafeteria.
Hmm.
He looks 10 years older than I do now, and I think he's 15 years younger. But
well, maybe it's a good thing you didn't keep flying, keep piloting it.
I expect so. Had a lot of fun and a lot of adventures flying too, but never got hurt, which is pretty lucky, you know. But one reason I didn't in those early days, plane had a top speed of maybe 90 miles an hour, but the main thing was not a slow top speed, but a slow landing speed. You'd land at 30, 35 miles an hour. You could land most anywhere and run 150 yards and stop. And unless you ran abruptly into a fence or a ditch, well, you could usually get on all right, you know.
The did you follow when Wiley Post he came into prominence rather suddenly when he won that race, isn't that correct?
That's right, yes. And then he went to work for Will Rogers, didn't he? At least
well, I don't think he went to work for him.
I
think they became
just friends, and he
friends.
flew for him. Yes, yeah. And he invented this flying suit that would enable a pilot to go up to some 30,000 feet in the air, you know.
Wiley Post did?
Yeah, Wiley Post invented that. He was a very able fellow indeed. Yes, indeed. One of the early experiences in the air, of course, was, I may have told you this in your previous interview, but I got to know Charles Lindbergh pretty well. In fact, I
believe you did.
There's a picture in there. I did not?
No, you didn't.
Well, Earl Halliburton here, who established what later became TWA, had an airline that went from here down to Dallas and on to Atlanta and back. And Earl was a little fellow, established the Halliburton Oil Company, you know.
Yeah, yes.
But Earl, he was a cocky little fellow. He always said that any business anybody could run, he could run it better. He didn't care what it was. But he and Lindbergh somehow became acquainted. Anyway, Earl invited me to go down from here down to Dallas and pick up Lindbergh, go on to Houston, and fly from there down to Corpus Christi, Texas, where they're opening their first airport down there, called the International Airport. And I took my son Gene along, who was then 12. And he and I flew with Earl Halliburton and Lindbergh, as I told you, and that was our first trip over water from Houston. You know, the Gulf curves quite a bit, and we were out over the ocean there in a Ford trimotor, trundling along about 90 miles an hour, which was its top speed, and got down to I don't mean Corpus Christi, I mean Brownsville. And at Brownsville, I had quite a reception and wittiness, and the Mexicans had arranged a barbecue for us across the line, and we went over there for the barbecue about 6 o'clock in the evening, 6:30. Gene and I always remember this. I don't know whether Lindbergh did or not, but they served us goat meat and homemade baked bread out there, you know, and they roast the goat meat and beer. And the goat meat has been cut in squares, about an inch square, cubes, I mean, and it was bristling with hairs. And Gene and I couldn't get any of it down. I forget them whether Lindbergh or not, or Halliburton. We'd take a piece and nibble on it, but that was too much for us. And Gene, of course, didn't drink the beer. And I didn't like it, but it was quite an occasion being with Lindbergh, and then we flew back with him up to Dallas. But I treasure that experience. And
This is a continuation with Mr. Harvey Everest. Um, we've been talking about the Braniff. Do you recall? Now you all actually lost money on Braniff. You and your original partners, isn't
Yes,
that
we
right?
did. We lost quite a bit of money on it until we got quite unhappy with the airline business.
I guess it had to. I guess it had to spread out and become bigger in order to make any money.
I think that's true with all airlines in the early days. Yeah, we were no exception to the rule. It was just there just weren't enough passenger people who wanted to ride in an airplane in those days, and they just developed that.
I know in the 30s when they were trying to make Oklahoma City an air center as much as they could. A great promotion was made to move airmail traffic in and out of Oklahoma City. Did you have any involvement with that, or do you remember that?
No, I had no involvement in that, except perhaps as a vice president of the Chamber of Commerce or something of that kind.
I know, looking at some of the Oklahoma issues of the Chamber publication, there was a lot of promotion on using airmail because they had to have a certain quota had to come in and out in order to keep that airmail plane coming in.
That's right. That's true. I've forgotten that, but you're right about that.
Let's think of some other people and talk about some other people I know you've had some close involvement with, and one is Frank Buttram, certainly one of the classic names in oil in Oklahoma City and in culture and many other things. Why don't you talk about Frank Buttram?
Frank and I and all our families, matter of fact, our families were very, very close indeed. We belonged to the Christian church here in Oklahoma City, both families, and we're deeply involved in the church, and of course in many civic activities. Frank and I served side by side, and socially we're together frequently. We organized a dinner bridge club, in which we had a lot of fun for many, many years. And by the way, Mrs. Everest and I are the only surviving members of that bridge club. But
who were the others?
well, the C.R. Anthony's, the Lou Mecklenburg's, Virgil Brown's, Roland Rodman's. Let me see who else is on there. I've forgotten at the moment, but there were 6 families. I mentioned the Mecklenburgs, I think. And but there wasn't anything going on in Oklahoma City that Frank and I weren't involved in together. For instance, we were involved in the very first instance of inducing the United States military forces to establish a facility out where what's called now Tinker Field, and we were instrumental in the Chamber, of course, getting to buy that. I think we bought 600 acres of land first to give to the government. Next, we had to sell Oklahoma City against Wichita as our principal competitor. They were a fierce competitor too. But I recall vividly that they sent Lieutenant F.S. Borum over here from. His home was in Muskogee, but I forget where he was stationed. Maybe at Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio, to look into the two cities, and we really did royally entertain young Fritz Borum in those days. When he came here, we put him up at the Biltmore and wined him and dined him and showed him everything we could about Oklahoma, and anything bad we concealed, and we prevailed. And it was on his recommendation that that first facility out there came to Oklahoma City, and it's developed into probably the greatest industry, I guess no doubt about it, for the whole state of Oklahoma that came out of that early effort. V.V. Harrison and I, and I don't mean even me, but V.V. Harrison, Tom Braniff, Mr. Gaylord, Frank Buttram, and I, and C.R. Anthony and Virgil Brown, I believe, were the group of the chamber that, and of course you can't forget Stanley at the head of the procession there, whose imagination I expect it was in the first place to try to get that facility here. But and then we had a home, and we do have home yet in Colorado, and the Buttrams bought a home up there also. They used to go up and spend some time with us summer times and sometimes in the winter with us. And so our association continued all throughout the year and the years, and Frank and I and Virgil Brown, Mr. Anthony, L.H. Pritchard owned several boats together. They might be called yachts, but we never quite dignified them with that name, which we kept down the Gulf Coast, and we just had an awful lot of fun on those boats, duck hunting in the wintertime, and cruising the Gulf of the Caribbean in the summertime. And so our relationship with the Buttrams was just great.
You recall any good stories about him?
Oh, Frank was, I don't recall any real good stories about Frank, but fundamentally Frank was a very serious guy. He had his light moments all right, but Frank was very, very proud, and justly so, of his expertise as a geologist, because he made a lot of money at it. Frank did have one failing, which proved to be an almost fatal failing, and that was that he never could bring himself to sell any land that he had bought for oil development, and that really caused his untimely death, we think, because he became too involved, and he was tremendously worried. A very proud man, and unjustly proud too. But he couldn't take any sense of failure on his part in his judgment, and I think that is what finally helped destroy his mind. It was a very sad thing. But during his heyday, he was one of the great men of Oklahoma. The greatest disappointment in Frank's life, of course, was running for governor against this odd character from Tishomingo, Bill Murray, and to have Bill Murray snow him under so tremendously, Frank never got over that humiliation.
He ran the wrong year.
He ran the wrong year. That's right. But Bill Murray was 10 times as astute a politician as Frank ever was. Bill Murray was the man that people wanted for those times, and not a rich oil man from Oklahoma City. And it's quite an experience for Frank. But Frank was always a great churchman, a great booster for our ministers, and served as chairman of our board for years, and the church board. And a lot of fun in our social life too.
Now, you knew Bill Alexander, and I know if you don't know any stories on him, well, you don't know. Why don't you talk about Bill Alexander?
I was Bill's closest friend all of his life here in Oklahoma City. The fact is, our two families were that close. I don't mean to say just me, but all of us were. And Bill and his wife, kids used to visit us in our summer home in Colorado in the summertime, and we'd play tennis at our home here at 63rd and Lincoln, or Edmond Road as we called it. We had a tennis court there, and nearly 2 or 3 times a week in good weather, while Bill would come out, and we had some great games of tennis. And he was just a great fellow for athletics or for fun of any kind. He really was. He was a great competitor. I recall very vividly at Grand Lake in Colorado, we taught him to ski, our 2 boys and I did, and water ski. And of course he liked to be proficient at anything he did, and we'd attached 3 lines back of the motorboat and put Bill in the middle. And when he got to where he thought he was pretty good, why, first our son Howard and next our son Gene would move over next to him, and unknown to him would tip up the back of his ski and dump him in the water. You never knew what happened to him, but we dunked him dozens of times before we ever really caught on to what was happening to him. But he was just a lot of fun, and he had a great mind, a very active mind. And we had great times together. And he was a great minister for the Christian church for a good many years of his ministry. Unfortunately for Bill, he took on a great many speaking engagements, and which gave him less and less time for his church, and finally got so that I finally one day made up my mind that Ms. Everest and I would leave the church and go to Crown Heights, which was a devastating blow to him. But I said, if you want, we can still be the closest of friends, but you don't quite fill the bill as my minister anymore. And, but that friendship was not interrupted and continued until the time of his death. I'm sure he respected our decision, but he could never bring himself away from the great pleasure he got in lecturing and the stimulus he got from it. He was a very generous individual. He gave more, I knew of this for a fact, he gave more to our United Appeal than all of the other ministers in Oklahoma City combined, year after year. And at his death, he left the church $400,000, and he left his children an equal amount. I think he probably died one of the wealthiest ministers to ever live, at least in the Southwest country. And
that was that insurance policy.
Insurance policies that he carried, and we carried on him at the church. But he was a great spirit with a fine mind and a very quick mind. Another one of his vices or virtues, as you choose to call it, was his card-playing ability. He and Bob Kerr were great bridge players, as were some of the rest of us were lesser bridge players, but we often played with them. But he and Bob Kerr were great competitors. Neither one of them wanted to lose either, I tell you. And we had a lot of pleasure in those bridge sessions, too. One time I recall he got to our house, he got to playing with a friend of my attorney who fancied himself a real good gin rummy player and played with Bill Alexander. We had a group there playing bridge and gin. And finally the rest of them left about 11 o'clock, and this attorney and Bill Alexander kept on playing because this attorney was losing. He didn't want to quit. And finally at 12:30 I said, "You fellows quit now, we're going to turn the lights off and you go home." So they got up after that hand, and Bill had a whole bunch of slips of paper in front of him, which were IOUs from this attorney. The amount of some $2,200, which left me aghast. He just tore them up and threw them in the wastebasket. Because Bill never wanted to take advantage of anybody for money, but this attorney wanted to make some money off of him. Instead of that, he kept losing. But that was characteristic of Bill, his innate kindliness and generosity. He was a great competitor, but he's also generous and would not take advantage of anybody in this world. He was a good father, just a very, very fine gentleman. And it was too bad he had this airplane crash that killed he and his wife on a trip to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where he was going for a speech one Sunday evening, you know. Got in the fog and crashed on what they thought was a airport strip. It was
At Hershey, wasn't it?
At Hershey. It was a parking lot for a shopping center, you know. You recall that. But that was he was a great friend and contributed a lot to our lives, and I hope we did some to his.
He had the best sense of audience reaction of anyone I've ever seen.
There's no question about it. In 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, he could get any audience with him, whether it was a General Motors board or what it was. You know, it didn't make any difference. He could get them with him. He was a tremendous sense of the dramatic and when they went away, they took some with them, not just to, you know, not just a flowery speech. So he was a good man.
he played quite a role in general fundraising in Oklahoma City, particularly from the standpoint of the appeal end, not so much the administration as being able to take a meeting and well, for several years he did the cerebral palsy. He was
oh yeah, that's right.
Symphony a couple of years.
Oh yes, he would do anything like that, and did it better than anybody else would do.
Mm-hmm.
He really was. He never turned it down for appeal to help Oklahoma City. He was just there's been no other minister at least compare with him and his not only his willingness but his capacity to do it.
I'd say this about Bill Alexander also. I was a member of his church up until he died, and he although he was gone a great deal of time, I never saw anyone who consumed himself more in the hours that he put in wherever it was than he did. He would.
That's correct. He was.
Even though he'd be out of town quite a bit, he would his counseling would run right through lunch and evening hours, and he'd just have sandwiches brought in and eat.
That's right.
As he went, you know.
So he devoted every hour to his life, and he had such a mind that he could envisage a sermon, Sunday morning sermon, and develop it in probably a tenth of the time the rest of us could do that sort of thing, you know. And he was had a very unusual mind.
But he was losing his eyesight pretty badly at the time he died.
Yes, I recall that, Penn, and I would not have recalled it had you not told me. He was that was coming on very rapidly, I believe, and you're right.
Talk a little about Ellie Mecklenburg. You were telling a little before we were on the recorder. Why don't you talk a little about him?
Well, Lou was a good friend of mine for many years. We were active here in civic life in Oklahoma City, and in his earlier years in Oklahoma City, or in his middle years, he was just as active as C.R. Anthony and many of the rest of us were, and we were great friends. I kept up, of course, with his development of his manufacturing business out there. He was a genius at inventing machinery. First, he was a genius so far as anticipating needs of the public were concerned. He could conceive of a new gadget, such as the weather strip he started with, and then all kinds of other allied things that were useful in a household. He would dream them up, and not only that, he would then personally go to his machine shop, and he and 2 or 3 machinists would design the type of lathe or equipment needed to produce that item. And one of the most remarkable things about him was the fact that in all of the history of that company, and it's truly a great industrial company now, a great manufacturing company, he never was necessary to borrow any money from a bank or from anyone. He developed that business out of the profits that he made out of that business. One unique thing, I might digress a minute, about the company is that they sell all over the world, but they do not charge any transportation. Their prices are quoted FOB Oklahoma City. And that makes it pretty easy for a retailer to know exactly what his cost is. He doesn't have to pay anything else. He buys and it's delivered to him. But and L.A. liked to entertain, and we liked to entertain them. His wife, Pansy, was a lovely person, too, and lots of fun. They liked to play bridge and gin. But when Lou first came to Oklahoma City from Dakotas, he had a little weather strip business up there, and he had a partner, Duncan, whom he bought out. If you got time, I'll tell you a little story what Lou used to tell us about North Dakota. You know, the early days up in North Dakota, all the traveling salesmen had to travel by train from one town to another because there was no other means of transportation. Didn't have any roads and no motor cars. And one day he was traveling from one little town to another up there, about 15 miles apart. And cold in the wintertime, very cold, just frigid. I got off the train, trudged up to the little hotel, and the hotel clerk checked them all in, about a dozen of these salesmen. Spend the night there, you know. And he gave me each one of them a pitcher of water to take up to the room with him. Also gave him a coal oil heater. And he went to bed. Next morning, when I all came down for breakfast, and then each one of them went to their separate businesses. He went to the hardware stores doing his selling. And then about 11 o'clock, the train came through, and all of them at the hotel got their bags and trudged on down the train, you know. And going from the hotel down to the train, he fell in step with a little fellow that he'd noticed from the train before. And this fellow had a great big newspaper package around. And Lou said he was always a curious guy, and he asked this little fellow, say, pardon me, but what in the world you got in that bundle? So you didn't have any bundle like that when you came in last night. The fellow was quite embarrassed. He said, no, I said I didn't, but you said last night, you know, I learned this morning, got it 26 below zero last night, but last night I put my teeth in the wash basin with some water, and because they froze solid, and he said I couldn't get them out, so I wrapped up the wash basin in a towel, and then a newspaper. I had to put this near the stove on the train to get my teeth out. Well, he used that to illustrate how cold it got in those days up there. But anyway, when he came down here, I've forgotten why, but he became a bank teller at a little bank on Grand Avenue right next to the City Hall. And the City Hall was in at Grand and Broadway, where it was for many, many years. And it was a pretty rough area in there down. There were lots of houses of ill repute, and the police station often made raids in those days on the prostitutes. Lou likes to tell, was it true or not, I don't know, but he went out he heard the paddy wagon them talking out the back of the bank, and so he walked out the bank about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were loading a bunch of ladies into the paddy wagon to take them to jail, and there were 2 or 3 fellows hanging around, and the police told Lou and these other guys, get in here. They figured they were part of them. So Lou was taken down to the police station with these prostitutes. Took him a little time to make himself known to get out, but that was one of his stories. But one real nice thing about Lou was that he came from a very religious German family, Lutherans, of course, and he had a very deep affection for his mother. And long after she had died, in fact, until Lou's death, whenever they entertained, he always would say grace himself in German in his mother's invocation, her mother's prayer at dinner time. And although he was not a religious man himself, he belonged to the North Methodist Church, but First Methodist Church now, rarely ever attended, but he always said grace in his mother's prayer before every meal, and that really endeared himself to everyone. He was a generous person, and as I say, a genius in his own time and his own way.
And it is now a worldwide distributing
yes,
company.
They probably sell to 50,000 retailers world over, and they have some 600 different specialties they sell.
There's a corner I'd like for you to talk about, because it has been probably the most prominent banking corner in Oklahoma City, and it's the corner that we're really on right now, which is Main and Broadway. There have been banks on all 4 corners. The old Western National Bank, I believe, was in
That's right.
Why don't we talk about those 4 corners? One of them is where the city center is opening now. I know the original post office, the original permanent post office, was that old rock 3-story building that was next door to the Western National Bank. Do you remember that building or anything about it?
Well, I remember all 4 corners. Now, the southeast corner was in the Huckins Hotel, and that was where the American National Bank was established. And on the
and even before that, the First National was there. Not as a permanent building, but
not on that
but
corner.
as a wooden building.
Was it? If it was, I do not know
back
that.
in 1890 or 18.
But the northwest corner was T.D. Turner had the Western National Bank, as you said. Turner, I didn't know him, but just casually. Of course, I was a young boy. And he was a tight-fisted fellow. Never would give any money to anything except to one enterprise. At Christmas time, he would always give shoes to the poor. And he always got my mother to come down and give him a list of shoes she needed for all the poor people she could find in Oklahoma City. And he'd give her a check for them, cheerfully. But that was it. No more money for any other enterprise. But he always do that. I recall that about him.
Did Turner run the Western National as long as it went broke in about 1918? Did he run it up until it went broke?
I think so. All those banks, one time or another, went broke. You know, and the American National Bank, which is now in the First National Bank, they're the result of some, I believe, 21 mergers.
Mm-hmm.
And my father had the Bank of Commerce on the southwest corner.
When was it in existence?
From about 99, I guess, 1899, I believe. My father came down
Until about
from
when?
southern Kansas, and he was the vice president and really ran the bank. Only A.L. Duncan was the president of it. But the Guarantee Bank then never failed, but it merged with the Wilkin Hale Bank.
Where was the Guarantee?
Guarantee it was in a stone building on the southwest corner of Main and Broadway.
Southwest, yes.
Southwest corner.
Yes,
It was a stone building. You have to walk up half a flight of steps to the banking floor and half a step down. I think the tailor shop underneath. Next to that was the Hyman's clothing store and so on.
The Hub.
The Hub. That's right. Ben, you're old enough to remember that.
No, I don't remember.
Well, you remember the name, yes.
Yes.
Well, at any rate, and then that became another bank, which bought the old Hartwell Jewelry Company and used the Hartwell Jewelry Company jewelry vault in the bank for a good many years. And then my father got W.R. Ramsey up here from Ardmore as a young fellow. And he was in the oil business in Ardmore, and he brought Walter Ramsey into the bank with him. And Walter hadn't worn shoes very long. He was a bright youngster, but a young part Indian, 1/8, I guess, maybe a quarter. And then then he and father both quit the bank. That bank never did fail on my father's side, but then he and Walter Ramsey established a bank called the Guarantee Bank, which is now where the Continental Building Loan is, where the Skirvin Tower later became there. And right across west from the Skirvin. And they operated that for a good many years, and then it was merged with Liberty National Bank when it was formed in soon afterwards.
Right.
Soon after, probably 20 or 21 or 22. And father then became a vice president of Liberty just for a year or two. But in the meantime, he and Ramsey and Walter had got some oil ventures together, and they bought a lease down in Louisiana for $8,000, which they sold not many years later for $2 million. And then father quit the bank too. He was about 65, I guess, at the time, and Walter also just devoted himself to the oil business. Then he and father dissolved their partnership, and father retired, and Walter went on to become wealthy and then lose his money again.
You built the Ramsey Tower and lost it.
Yes, and lost it. Lost that. But I've forgotten what we started on right now, or the banking system down here. The early banks, yes, early corners down there.
I've looked at some of the pictures of the period. Now, at one time, that southwest corner had a bank called First National Bank. I don't know whether it was you know, a First National Bank went broke, and then later one was.
Now that might have been the before the Lee Huckins Hotel was
no,
built.
it's the other side
Was
on
it?
the west. It is
Oh,
on
was
the
it?
west where you said the Guarantee was. Maybe it preceded. This was an 1890s picture.
Preceded the.
It preceded maybe the Guarantee was
No, I don't-
southwest, didn't
No,
you say?
I said the Bank of Commerce.
Bank of Commerce.
By the way, focus on the.
Yeah. To just kind of follow those corners, then the northwest corner was first was the western from about 1893 or so until 1918 when they sold it to the tradesmen's, and then tradesmen's had until they merged into First.
That's right.
Then on the now on this corner where we are now, which was a little different area, they had the old Bassett building on that corner, but it had banks in it. That's the northeast corner. What banks were in the Bassett building?
Northeast corner. It seems to me the only one I remember. I think it started out as the Night and Day Bank, which was merged into the Wilkin Hale, but I've forgotten who.
About when was it?
I do not recall that, sir. I do not
Was it in
recall
the
that.
early 1900s or was it late?
Oh, I'd say along in the 1907s or 8, somewhere along in there, Ken, yes. Pardon me, Pen, turn it off.
I think we're about through anyway.
Where Liberty National Bank is now, my wife's father, T.A. Whetstone, had a grocery store here for many years, way back in the 1900 to 1905 or 6 or 7, and he'd called Whetstone and Gray, and they delivered groceries anywhere in Oklahoma City in those days. But my wife was born where the 3rd and Robinson, where the post office is now, but her daddy had this grocery store right here where Liberty National Bank corner is.
Well, that's interesting. Well, this has been most interesting, I'd say about 3.5 hours that we've had together, and I really appreciate very much these. Yeah,
3.5 hours.
but I believe that we've had some real interesting things. And thank you very much, Mr. Harvey Everest.